Last week, as we studied the end of Mark's gospel, we heard that the Lord wanted the disciples to go and proclaim the good news of the resurrection. But fear kept them silent. Still, the Lord did not focus on their failures. Rather, he reminded them of their mission. Go and proclaim the good news to every creature. That was last week. This week, we read from Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus is preaching in Jerusalem just days before his crucifixion. Here, too, Jesus reminds us of our mission as believers. And again, Jesus says that fear is one of the things that keeps us from being obedient and faithful. This week we read from the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus tells a rather lengthy parable about a master who goes on a journey. He entrusts large sums of money to several servants. And when the master returns, he reviews what these servants have done with his treasure. If we look at what comes before this parable in Matthew's Gospel, we see that this parable is not really all about money. It's about our mission as believers. Starting in chapter 24, Jesus preaches a series of parables, and he uses imagery about a master or a bridegroom. They've gone away, and people are awaiting their return. And we're told in all of these parables that we have a task to do while we wait, a task that will also give us hope while we wait. Jesus speaks these parables just days before he is crucified. So in that context, we can understand that Jesus is our master who is leaving us through the crucifixion. And yes, he has promised to return. So Jesus tells parables here to help us understand our mission while we await his return. What are believers supposed to do? What are we supposed to do while we await the master's return? How can we remain hopeful? And what do we do so that we won't be controlled by fear? When will Jesus return as promised? Well, the message is clear. As for the exact hour or day, no one knows it, only the Father. So, Jesus says, stay awake. Or as another translation puts it, be prepared. Which raises a question. What does it mean for us to be prepared? What should we do to stay awake? The next verses in Matthew's Gospel begin to answer those questions. Jesus praises the faithful servant whom the master has put in charge of his household to dispense food at need. While the master's away, we, his servants, are called to notice who is hungry and to feed them from the abundance that the master has given us. Then in chapter 25, we hear the parable of the 10 virgins awaiting the arrival of the groom. 5 of them understood that their job was to spread light when the groom finally returned to the house. So they obtained the oil they needed to light their lamps. 5 were wise. The other 5 were foolish. They could not spread the light because they had not gathered what was needed to light their lamps. So the lesson is clear. Obtain the skills necessary to create light wherever there's darkness. Followers of Christ are meant to bask in his light and to reflect that light to others. And you can't wait until the last minute. This parable ends with that familiar reminder: keep your eyes open, for you know not the day nor the hour. So up to this point, Jesus has taught us that we will be prepared by serving others, noticing and feeding the hungry. And if we do the daily work he gives us, we'll be ready to spread his light when the time comes. That's the context. Now we come to the parable that we will hear at Mass this weekend. Jesus tells a story about a master who is going away on a journey. And frankly, when early Christians heard this parable after the events of Easter, they realized that this is a story about Jesus, who has left the earth in his bodily form, and the people in this story who are awaiting his return, that's us. In verse 15, the master entrusts his treasure to his servants. And the word that's used here is talents. The master gave talents to his servants. The Greek word is talanta, and that's a word for a coin which represents a huge amount of money. So when the parable speaks about talents, the master giving talents to his servants, we're not talking about musical talent or athletic talent or your ability to cook a really good cheesecake. The Greek word talent, talanta, refers to a huge sum of money. It's the kind of word we might use when we say something like this: "Oh, I wouldn't do that for $1 million. In Greek, that might sound, "I wouldn't do that for a talent." 1 talent is a huge sum of money. 5 talents is an overwhelmingly huge amount of money. The master calls 3 servants. To one of them he gives 5 talents. To another he gives 2, and to another he gives 1. And I can hear you out there. Some of you are already screaming, "That's not fair! Everybody should get the same amount." But let's not forget, the person who got 1 talent received $1 million, and he did nothing to earn it. In other words, our generous God is not being unfair by giving a different amount of treasure to different people. The master is being overwhelmingly generous to all of them, every one of them. And we're also reminded in this aspect of the parable that God knows something that we often forget. Different people have different capabilities. Some are entrusted with certain responsibilities, others get other responsibilities. The master gives all 3 of them a huge amount of money. And in the giving, he also recognizes the unique capability of every individual. God knows that we're all different. In verses 16 and 17, we're told, immediately the one who received 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5. And likewise, the one who received 2 made another 2. Now, I am obviously no financial expert, but I do know this. If I want to invest in something, I have to take money, which I have here in my hand, and give it to somebody else. Maybe I give my money out of my hand to my investment advisor, or I hand my money to a banker and say, "Here, you take care of this for me and make it grow." So notice, the first 2 servants receive an amazingly generous gift from their master, and they do not cling to it or try to hold on to it as their own possession. They receive it into their hands, and then they put it into other people's hands. And that's how the treasure multiplies in the parable. How does the treasure not multiply? Well, it won't multiply if we follow the example of the third servant. In verse 18 we read, "But the man who received 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money." I think of residents of the South during the Civil War who took their silver and dug a hole out in the field somewhere and hid the silver from the invading Yankees. You know, if you want to hide something valuable, it seems safe to dig a hole and put it in the ground. So this third servant receives a treasure which he hides. Then, in verse 19, Jesus says, "After a long time, the master of those servants came back and settled accounts with them." Interesting verse. Let's notice a couple of things here. First, this verse says that the master has been away a long time. Many of us will hear that and say, yes, it's been a long time since Jesus walked on the earth, and we've been waiting for him. And sometimes in our waiting, our patience gets tested. Secondly, this verse says that the person who comes back is the master. The Greek word in this verse is kyrios. And actually, we use that word in our liturgy at Mass to refer to Christ when we say, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. That's who's described as coming back in this verse. Then the third thing to notice about this verse, we're told that the Lord returns after a long time to settle accounts. Now, in our tradition, in the Christian tradition, we call this the second coming of Christ, or we call it the final judgment. I know some of us don't like that language, judgment. But the scriptures make it very clear. When you and I stand before the Lord, the truth of our lives will be made clear in the light of Christ's love. Nothing will be hidden. And like the servants in the parable, there will be a basic truth-telling that has to take place. And the truth-telling that happens in this parable and in our lives is this: Lord, you gave me this precious, priceless gift of life. Here's what I did with it. Lord, you gave me the priceless gift of love. Here's what I did with it. Lord, you gave me the priceless gift of my abilities. Here's what I did with them. Did I share these priceless gifts? Did I pay attention to the people around me who were in need? Or did I let fear control me so that I hid every gift God gave? The master comes back after a long time to settle accounts, to see everything clearly and honestly. Jesus says that the servant who received the 5 talents stands before his master. He received the gift from his master. He handed that gift over to others to invest and trade, and they multiplied. So he gives his master the original 5 talents plus 5 more. There's almost an ironic tone in verse 21. The master says, "Since you were faithful in small matters, I will give you great responsibilities." Small matters? Remember, just one talent is a huge sum of money. There's nothing small here. But let's think this through. Isn't it true that sometimes we lose sight of just how amazing God's gifts can be, how amazing God's gifts are? We lose a sense of gratitude, so God's amazing gifts, well, they become small in our minds. So many of us take our health for granted, or we take family for granted. We take life for granted. These gifts can become small in our perception. They might seem insignificant, but they're really magnificent gifts. Still, God keeps entrusting to us these amazing gifts. And as the parable has told us, and as human experience teaches us as well, if we share them generously, God's going to entrust even more to us. And the ultimate gift is named at the end of this verse. Come, share your master's joy. Isn't that a great description of eternity? Joy in God's presence forever. In verse 23, we hear a similar conversation with the servant who had received the 2 talents. He likewise took the gift into his hand and then handed it over and did things with it and traded and invested. He returns the multiplied amount to his master. He too is invited to share his master's joy. In verse 24, the final servant steps forward. He knows that the master expects a harvest where none seems possible. And in verse 25, the servant says, "So, out of fear, I went off and buried your talent in the ground. Here it is back." Do you recall how last week we heard that fear kept the disciples from proclaiming the good news of the resurrection? And now here we are this week in verse 25, and we hear that fear is controlling this character in the gospel parable. A wise pastor once told me that we all must learn to name what we're afraid of. Many of us pretend that we're never afraid. Not of anybody, not of anything. But as they tell us in the 12-step recovery programs, we are only as sick as our secrets, including the secrets we try to keep from ourselves. So let the light of Christ shine very brightly in your life so that you can name what causes you fear. And then pay attention to what that fear is telling you. Pay attention because usually fear is lying to you. Let me give an example. When I was a little boy, I refused to jump off the high diving board at our local pool. My brother kept accusing me of being a scaredy cat. But I would tell him, "I'm not afraid." But that was a lie. I was afraid. And finally, somebody asked me, "Well, what are you afraid of?" And I realized that fear was telling me that I couldn't do it, or that I could never be good at jumping off or diving into the pool from the high dive. You know what? These were the lies that my fear was telling me, and I was listening to the lies. Fear lies to us all the time. Fear tells us, "You can't do this. No one will ever love you. You'll never be good enough. There isn't any hope. It's never going to get better. God doesn't care about you. Your life has no meaning. These are some of the lies that fear whispers into our ear. These lies lead us to do what the servant did in the parable. Receive an amazing gift from the Lord and then hide it because fear is telling you that there's nothing else you can do. So the gift, well, it gets dirty. It collects dust. My friends, your life is God's gift to you. What you do with your life is your gift back to God. But fear will keep telling you that nothing you ever do will be good enough for God. So don't try anything. That's a lie. Next, the master says, take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will grow rich. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Yikes! Is this verse saying that God wants the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer? But please remember, this is a parable about our relationship to God, about how we're called to be prepared while we're waiting for his kingdom. The priceless gift that the Lord has given us is life. It's faith, it's love. And if fear makes me hide those gifts, isn't it the case that we ourselves are choosing to live an impoverished life? I once knew a man who was rather impatient, stuck in his ways, unforgiving. He frankly became fearful and intolerant of other people. He became lonely. He chose to cut off his relationship with his daughter and thus chose not to see his grandchildren. God had given him this priceless gift, actually several priceless gifts: life, health, relationships, family. He literally chose to do nothing with them. So his world grew smaller and smaller, and he became more and more lonely. God didn't have to take away his gifts. His own choices were creating his ever-shrinking experience. Because of fear, he chose to lose God's gifts in so many ways. So please keep remembering, this is a parable. And in the parable, Jesus is not giving us advice about mutual funds. This is a parable about what we're called to do as we await the return of our risen Master. And in this parable, God invites us, first, to be grateful for the amazing, priceless gifts of life and love and relationships and faith that God has given us. And remember, we didn't earn any of those gifts. They're given freely by the God who loves us. Secondly, this parable tells us that we're called to understand that these gifts are given to us so that we can share them with others. That's how life and love and faith keep growing in our world, by our sharing them. This parable, thirdly, teaches us to understand that a disciple of Jesus is called to be creative in sharing God's gifts. Don't listen to the lies that fear keeps telling you. And fourthly, this parable reminds us that there will come a day when we stand before the Lord. The light of his love will make the truth of our lives crystal clear. Nothing stays hidden. And the one who helps us to see this truth loves us more than we can imagine. In verse 30, we're told that those who choose to do nothing with God's gifts end up outside in the dark. Throughout Matthew's gospel, when people get thrown out of the master's presence or choose to leave the master's presence, it's always described as a place of darkness in Matthew. You see, you can hide in the dark, but it's also cold in the dark. The light may force you to see things you don't want to see about yourself, but the light also keeps us warm. And in that dark place of separation, we realize that we are separated from the one who loves us perfectly. And the pain of that separation causes us to grind our teeth, Matthew says. In other words, if we choose separation from God, well, we're going to feel the effects of our choices. And those effects are not comforting. So here we are at the end of verse 30. Remember that way back in chapter 24, we heard that we have to pay attention and be ready. Next week, we'll hear that when Jesus comes again, he's going to have questions for us about whether we fed the poor, visited the sick, and clothed the naked. So tune in next week. And this week, when fear tries to lie to you, don't listen.